Did you know that people are the world's greatest resource? That's because people, unlike animals, when faced with a problem, can innovate and overcome those problems. And they do it through freedom and brain power. And the more people you have, the more brain power you have to solve problems. Yeah, so people are wonderful. Hi there, mommies. This is Sherry Hayes with MomDelights.com. I'm the mom of 15 children. I've been homeschooling for over 3 decades, and I want to share something with you today that will bless you and help you in your life. So go ahead and wash the dishes, sweep the floor, diaper the babies, and listen as we dig into that good life in Jesus. So today we are continuing with our study on the overpopulation myth. Now we're actually doing a study on babies, and part of my study is going to get down to practical things. Now today we're just talking mostly about the philosophical foundations of why babies are a good thing and why we should want more babies. Now we're not fear-mongering here. We're not saying if you don't have babies you're not a good person, or if people don't have babies the world's going to end, blah blah blah. That's not really, that's how we've been taught to feel, like we're motivated by some imminent threat someplace. I don't want you to do that. I want you to just get so close to the Lord that if he wants you to have babies, you will. But it's not like he's going to like twist your arm and say, if you don't have babies, the world will end and evil will, nothing like that. No. Okay, remember the Bible says in Psalm 127 that children are an heritage of the Lord. Okay, so babies are for him. He loves babies. They're his heritage. So if we love him, you might want to give him a few babies just to say, I love you, God. But you can get to that yourself. What we're going to talk today about is the people that want to hurt God by eliminating the babies. And in subsequent podcasts, we're going to talk about the practicals of where did this anti-baby thing actually practically show itself politically, and how did it work out to become part of our psyche? How did we get to birth control and abortion and immorality and all that kind of stuff? We're going to go through that. That's going to be a great history, and you're going to really, oh man, I'm going to share some stuff with you. It's going to curl your hair, okay? And then after that, we're going to talk about practical things about pregnancy and childbirth and all the myths we've all learned about that and how they're not necessarily true either. That's going to be a big one. And then we are going to talk about the practicalities of how you actually rear babies and children and all that kind of stuff, right? And so it's going to be pretty involved, and it's going to take a number of weeks, but I think we'll all enjoy it. I hope you do. So today we're continuing. Yesterday we started talking about the myth of overpopulation, especially concerning the resources and nature and room on Earth. Okay, so we're going to go over a brief history of the overpopulation mythology. All right. Now, Solzhenitsyn, we talked about last time. He was a Russian gentleman, a Soviet gentleman, a Russian gentleman under the Soviet regime, who was put in a gulag for a number of years, and he interviewed people who survived the gulags, or maybe they didn't always survive, but anyway, his fellow prisoners, and he came up with a lot of philosophical understanding of how people can become so evil as to do the unthinkable to their fellow humans. And we quoted that before. Now we're going to continue with Solzhenitsyn's idea and explore just how this evil ideology came down to us in our current time. All right. In the book Superabundance, which I also mentioned before, and it's written by 2 gentlemen, and it's a wonderful book, and I own it, and you should own it too. It's if you come across a lot of people, like relatives and close friends, and you kind of are more open to children, and they're always feeding you all the dire statistics. This is like ammunition, right? Not to be rude to them, but just even if they're not open to you talking to them about it, in your mind, you'll have that, so you'll be able to be calm and at peace no matter what they attack you with. All right. Now, in Superabundance, that book, we learned that throughout human history, most leaders were happy with population increases, while there were only a few dissenters for various reasons. Okay, this all changed with the entrance of Reverend Thomas Malthus. Okay, this is in the 1800s. Malthus was fascinated with geometric growth rates and saw a parallel between the population behaviors of animals and humans. He believed that, like humans, when resources are abundant, population increases, and when the population increases, the resources are depleted, which leads to starvation and disease, which keeps the population in check. So his idea was that the earth can only sustain so many people comfortably, so that when the human population rises above that level, then everybody starves and it goes back down and it stays at a constant. Now, at the time that he wrote that book, I believe there are only 400 million people on the earth, and there are 8 billion people on the earth today. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we read on. Okay. Actually, if you have ever watched a rendition of Dickens' A Christmas Carol, you are familiar with the basic Malthusian doctrine. And you go, what? You know what A Christmas Carol is, the show Scrooge. It's been turned into movie after movie after movie, and Dickens actually wrote it in installments in a newspaper, and he published it as a book called A Christmas Carol, and it's actually about Scrooge and how he's all Scroogey and he doesn't like Christmas, all humbug and all that kind of stuff, right? So there's a scene at the beginning of the book, and he's interacting with two gentlemen that come into his office, and they're asking for donations for the poor. And if you go to my website, momdelights.com, I actually have a blog post where I quote this portion of the book, so you can read it for yourself. But at a certain point, it goes like this. Okay, let's see. So under the impression that they scarcely furnish, and she's talking about, okay, let me go back a little bit. He says, are there no prisons? Because they're asking them to, okay, let's see. Scrooge frowned and shook his head and handed the credentials back. So they're showing their credentials for, gathering these funds for the poor. At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge, said the gentleman, taking up a pen, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute, who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessaries. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comfort, sir. Are there no prisons? Asked Scrooge. Plenty of prisons, said the gentleman, laying down the pen again. And the union workhouses? Demanded Scrooge. Are they still in operation? They are still, returned the gentleman. I wish I could say they were not. The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigor, then, said Scrooge. Both very, very busy, sir. Oh, I was afraid, from what you said at first, that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course, said Scrooge. I'm very glad to hear it. Under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body to the multitude, returned the gentleman, a few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time, of all others, when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for? Nothing, Scrooge replied. You wish to be anonymous? I wish to be left alone, said Scrooge. Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there. Many can't go there, and many would rather die. If they would rather die, said Scrooge, they had better do it, and decrease the surplus population. Besides, excuse me, I don't know that, but you might know it, observed the gentleman. So, that statement I just read. If they would rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Almost a direct quote from Malthus. In fact, Malthus and Scrooge had a lot in common, and it may be that Dickens had Malthus in mind when he penned his famous Christmas tale. He published the book, now he being Malthus, published the book, An Essay on the Principle of Population as it Affects the Future Improvement of Society, with remarks on the speculations of Mr. Goodwin and M. Condorcet and other writers. And as an aside here, this is from thoughtco.com, it had this to say about Thomas Malthus. Okay, Thomas Malthus was arguably the person who was most influential to Charles Darwin. Even though Malthus was not a scientist, he was an economist and understood populations and how they grow. Darwin was fascinated by the idea that the human population was growing faster than food production could sustain. This would lead to many deaths from starvation, Malthus believed, and force the population to eventually level out. Darwin applied these ideas to populations of all species and came up with the idea of, quote, survival of the fittest, unquote. And I know you've heard that one. Okay, Malthus' ideas seemed to support all of the studying Darwin had done on the Galapagos finches and their beak adaptations. Only individuals that had favorable adaptations would survive long enough to pass down those traits to their offspring. This is the cornerstone of natural selection. Okay, now that's the end of the quote there. This led to the creation of the theory of eugenics, which led to the death camps of World War II, as well as other attempts at genocide around the world in the 20th century. Okay, Malthus suggested these measures to keep these. Okay, so Malthus, according to his ideas, suggested the following measures to keep population in check. Okay, these are what we have been seeing in society being pushed on us for the last half century. Okay, you've got to listen. This will just perk your ears up, okay? He wanted to encourage prostitution and immorality so that venereal disease would increase and cause women to become infertile. That's one of his first suggestions. Think about it. Number 2, he wanted to encourage homosexuality because it is unfruitful. And here we thought it was about equity. No, it's about curtailing population through unfruitful acts of sex. Okay, that's what it's about. And everybody's being duped. One of the other things was to increase abortion. He wanted to increase abortion. What do we hear? Like, it's a right. It's a right. We have you're right. You're having a right to genocide. Voluntary genocide. Okay. The last one is to practice birth control. Believe it or not, they had birth control back then too, in the 1800s. Right? We just think it's a new thing, but it's not really. Okay. Now that sounds really familiar. We've come a long way in the production of food and everything in our world, and mankind has not undergone the dystopian nightmare that Malthus suggested. But somehow the popularity of his ideas have only increased. Okay. In 1968, a book was written which made overpopulation a household concern. It was written by Paul Ehrlich, a biologist well familiar with the feast or famine mindset of Malthus. His book was titled The Population Bomb. This was the oft-quoted opener of the book that I will read to you. The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. Now, I'm not certain that there weren't millions of people that didn't die from starvation during that time, but hundreds of millions of people in the 1970s died just because the earth was unable to sustain them. That wasn't the reason those people died, and you'll learn it as we go along. Okay, Ehrlich's ideas gained popularity partly through his appearances, 20 in all, on The Tonight Show, and that was an evening talk show that began in 1959. It was hosted by Johnny Carson and Jay Leno. Some of us remember it, some of us don't, but it ran for a long time. Okay, regular folks around the world began to talk about Ehrlich's and Malthus ideas. Now, they didn't know about Thomas Malthus, but they did know about Ehrlich. And so because he was on the talk show, everybody started talking about it. They even made their way into movies, the most notable of the time being Soylent Green with Chuck Heston, and as the main actor, as a star actor. And there have been many, many more. Soylent Green is one of those that gets referred to all the time. In Soylent Green, the population of the earth has grown, so it covers the earth in one huge megalopolis. So it's one huge city. And all the kelp beds and the fish have all died in the sea, and there's no arable land left. And so, he goes out and he gets a head of lettuce, and I guess a head of lettuce was like nearly impossible to afford, but he's like a policeman, so he's able to do it. And at the end, like everybody eats, there's these trucks that dump these dump these little green cracker things out of the back, and they're called Soylent Green, and that's what everybody lives on. And they've told everybody that this green algae that they get out of the ocean, right? But Chuck Heston finds out that it's actually human beings. Well, I've kind of spoiled it, I know. But anyway, so that's one of the dystopian movies made, and there are lots and lots of others that have been made since, and I'm sure you've heard of all of them, right? Okay, now, never mind that none of Ehrlich's prophecies have ever come to pass. Okay, he's always been wrong over and over and over again. In 1970, he was quoted as saying, "If I were a gambler, I would take even money that England will not exist in the year 2000." All right, and yet here we are 24 years later, and there's England still, as far as I can tell. In 2017, he was still harping. All right, in an address to a Vatican workshop on biological extinction, he said, quote, "Perpetual growth is the creed of a cancer cell," unquote. I told you you're going to hear cancer a lot. Referring to the, quote, "expansion of the human enterprise," unquote. Okay. Since Malthus and Ehrlich, many other darkened thinkers have arisen, but this is not the end of the story. Thankfully, the ideas of Malthus and his ilk have always been challenged. Many scholars in related fields have heartily disagreed with overpopulation concerns, but they just can't get a voice to be heard, so you never hear it. You never know that there's another side to the story. One such man was Julian Simon. This is a quote that he said, okay, "Our supplies of natural resources are not finite in any economical sense, nor does past experience give reason to expect natural resources to become more scarce. Rather, if history is any guide, natural resources will progressively become less costly, hence less scarce, and will constitute a smaller proportion of our expenses in future years." That's from Julian Simon in the book, The Ultimate Resource 2. You have to understand that that's partly because as a technology and ability and understanding increases, you use less resources to do more work. And think about it. Think about a car manufactured in 1939 and how much metal went into that car compared to a little car you drive now in the year 2024. I guarantee the amount of metals and resources used to make those two cars are very different. Now, some people would decry that. I wish we had tanks for cars, but they weren't always safer than the cars we drive today, just because they were thicker. I'm just saying, just think about that. Think about when they first started doing aluminum cans. I remember as a child, an aluminum can was really sturdy. Now, a child can take an aluminum can and just crush it, right? Because that's become so thin. So we're using less resources to do more things. That's just one way we haven't been thinking straight, okay? All right. Born the same year as Ehrlich, both of these gentlemen, Julian Simon and Paul Ehrlich, were born in 1932, okay? Simon was his greatest opponent. Simon began working on population studies in 1969, just after Ehrlich's book was published. So he agreed with Ehrlich at the beginning. This is his quote. "I assumed that the accepted view was sound. I aimed to help the world contain its, quote, exploding, unquote, population. But my reading and research led me into confusion. The available empirical data did not support that theory." Okay. He went on to write an answer to the population bomb entitled The Ultimate Resource in 1981 and The Ultimate Resource 2 in 1996, among a whole bunch of other books. Okay. Simon admitted that the growth of population can bring on short-term problems, but he found that people were also the means to solve these problems. Simon observed that people are the ultimate resource. This is because, contrary to the animal populations Malthus and Ehrlich observed, people can apply intelligence and ingenuity to problems and overcome them. Also, in times of distress, human beings can trade ideas and resources so that everyone profits in the long run. Animals do not have the ability to do things. Animals do not have the ability to do these things, so observations of the rise and fall of their numbers is not applicable to human populations. They have no relation to each other. Now, when we were talking, I talked to you earlier about the people that if you're in a country and you don't have enough rain for a number of years and you're going through a horrible famine, then what you do, just like in the times of Joseph, remember during Joseph's time, there was famine in the land. So the Egyptians had all the grain stored up, and the other countries of the world came and traded, and that kept them from starving because they relied on trade with Egypt. Get it? And what you find out if you go through all the poor starving children in Africa, etc., and so on and so forth, usually starvation in a day where we can do commerce with one another, starvation usually comes from the lack of ability to trade and to get the food to the people. You find that civil war causes more starvation than lack of water, because in civil war everything is disrupted. You can't drive, you don't have the gas for the trucks to drive the food to the people that are starving. It's more also about regimes, like whatever regime you're under. If you're under a totalitarian regime, then things are going to become less efficient, so that people don't get their needs met as readily as they would in a free, open society. So those are the things today that cause starvation more than like lack of rain, etc. Okay, Julian Simon has said, population growth does not hinder economic development or reduce the standard of living. Population growth has positive economic effects in the long run. Why have you never heard of Julian Simon while Paul Ehrlich's ideas are everywhere? Because the idea of people as a precious resource goes against the aims of a world which does not want to be governed by God. But we'll go into that later too. While his ideas were more valid and more substantiated than Ehrlich's, Simon was shoved to the fringes and heavily criticized. He never got on The Tonight Show. His papers weren't published. He just wasn't paid attention to, even though his prophecy of the future have come true, while Ehrlich's never have. Right? All right. But he also had his supporters, among whom was the Nobel Prize winner Friedrich Hayek in 1981. Hayek had read Simon's ultimate resource with enthusiastic agreement. Unlike Ehrlich, Julian Simon's predictions are coming to pass. Consider this long-run forecast he made before his death in 1998. Quote, "The material conditions of life will continue to get better for most people in most countries most of the time, indefinitely. Within a century or two, all nations and most of humanity will be at or above today's Western living standards. I also speculate, however, that many people will continue to think and say that the conditions of life are getting worse." That sounds right, doesn't it? Besides this historical narrative, the balance of the book that I've talked about so far, the superabundance book, is filled with arguments for the continued proliferation of human beings. Numerous data is presented which refutes the idea that we are populating ourselves into extinction, which sounds so totally absurd. Isn't that like an oxymoron? We're populating ourselves into extinction. Here are some highlights. Okay, these are things that they state in their book. Okay, it took 6 times as much land to feed people in the beginnings of farming than it does today. Okay, 6 times as much. And here's another idea. Less than 2% of the U.S. population is involved in farming. Did you know that? If the rest of the world was as productive at farming as the U.S., an area of arable land 10 times the size of Iowa could be returned to nature. Wow. So it's not like we're running out of nature. We can actually have more nature with more people. I know it sounds crazy, but it's true. Land dedicated to agriculture peaked at 12.15 billion acres in 2000 and has since gone down to 11.93 billion acres in 2017. That's quite a bit when you're talking in billions of acres, right? Now, during that time, the world population increased by 1 billion. Yet we use less arable land, but we have 1 billion more people. See, that's counterintuitive. We're not used to hearing it like that, are we? Okay. Forest coverage is increasing in rich countries because we're using less land to farm. We return that land to nature. So we have more forest. Did you know that we have the Northeast, the New England states, are more forested today than they were at the time of George Washington? That's the truth. Okay. Here's another point. Desalination is causing freshwater reserves to be replenished in the Middle East. So they're replenishing it with desalination, and they're coming up with better and better ways of desalinizing the ocean waters. Okay. Here's another idea. The share of humanity living on the edge of survival fell from 90% in 1820 to less than 10% today. So in 1820, 90% of the world was teetering on the edge of survival. Today, it's less than 10%. Okay, global and American living standards rose. Okay, global and American living standards rose 12-fold and 24-fold, respectively, over the past 2 centuries. So 200 years ago, we were in America, we were 12 times less. Our living standards were 12 times less prosperous, and the whole world was 24 times less prosperous. So the whole world, besides the United States, the whole world is much more populated than the United States. Their standards of living have risen 24 times in 200 years. Okay. Globally, people live more than 22 years longer than the richest people did in 1900. So in just a little over 100 years, life expectancy in the whole world has grown by 22 years. All right. In 1800, the average food supply in France, one of the richest countries in the world, was only 1,846 calories per day. In 2017, the average French calorie intake per diem was 3,558. Okay. And even in sub-Saharan Africa, the average was 2,449 daily calories. Keep in mind that the population of the world in 1800 was a fraction. I believe that was when it was like 400 million. Okay. 400 million in 2017 it was 7.5 billion. Okay. So it was 400 million in 1800. It's 7.5 billion in 2017, and yet the increase in population, with that increase, food is actually more abundant and not less abundant. That's important. Now, most of the book, Superabundance, is actually dedicated to exploring the data, which shows just how human beings have been able to meet increasing population with greater ability to support it. And they often talk about time cost of something, like how many hours did a person used to have to work to have a bowl of cereal, like a bowl of oatmeal, as compared to today. Okay, so you find that, in the past, it might have been 4 to 6 hours before you could have a bowl of oatmeal, whereas today it's like a fraction of an hour to have a bowl of oatmeal, right? Okay. And it's really decreased. We have much more time for leisure today than we ever have. Okay, and here's a thought that challenges all of the presuppositions we have been living under. Okay, and this is a quote from the book. More people can generate more ideas. Even if only a small fraction of humans can generate a good idea, the number of good ideas will grow in proportion to population growth. So with more people come more good ideas. Okay. Now, 2 of the main conclusions of this book are these. Number 1, what's needed to address current and future problems is freedom and brain power. Those are the 2 elements, okay? That's what they assert. All right. Freedom is necessary because it allows people to adapt and change without the oppressive weight of government prejudice and oversight. Okay. The number two idea that's thrust forward is limiting population growth not only limits brain power, it also means social engineering and violence. Now remember, we talked about what happened in China and India, and that's just a few examples. There are others around the world currently. And then we talk about Soviet Union. We can talk about America. We can talk about like countries wouldn't you think of that they're doing things to people. All right. So in order to get people, okay, so this is what I say. This is how I explain it. Okay. Let's see. Since reproduction, okay. By curtailing population, we are preventing people from being born who could grow up to solve our problems. Without freedom, we are preventing these problem solvers from impacting humankind for good. Since reproduction is a key part of human existence, attempts at coercive population control go against nature. It is like trying to keep the Mississippi River from emptying out into the ocean. The result would be an immense amount of energy expended with a disastrous amount of destruction as a consequence. When we keep people from having babies, the consequences are equally destructive. Human rights are trampled and the standard of living plummets, all right? Even after this lengthy post. Okay, so you understand that when we try to keep people from having babies, there is pushback and there are consequences, and they are dire, all right? Even after this lengthy podcast, I do not feel as though I have done the book Superabundance Justice. Okay, there is so much more included that could be explored, but not enough time to go over it all. The best thing would be to purchase it for yourself, and then you can have it, right? Having said all this, even the Georgia Guidestones I started with and all this kind of stuff, I have some of my own observations as well. Because we have been indoctrinated into materialistic thinking, our own decision-making skills have been hijacked by the idea that risk is evil and scarcity is a given. In the materialist view, resources and wealth are finite. There's only so much. There are only so many atoms, only so much energy in the universe, and all of this is slowly being used up and dissipated. There are also limited amounts of fossil fuel and water and sunshine, right? If one part of the world flourishes, it must be at the expense of another part of the world. If one part of the world is experiencing a moist year, then another one is experiencing a dry year. That's what we think. In this materialistic mindset, in order to be fair, quote unquote, we must force all resources and wealth to be spread out evenly. This does not mean everyone will be equally wealthy, but that everyone will be equally poor. And we must all swallow our medicine and be happy with whatever we get. You know, you will own nothing and you'll be happy, right? In this model, having more babies is ruinous. Babies use up the precious resources and therefore must not be allowed. The fewer the babies, the more to go around for the rest of us. All right, and who is the rest of us? Who decides who lives and who dies? Okay. We can easily point out this mindset in the world forums and summits that meet, you know, the G1s and the ones with acronyms like WWTTWN, which stands for What We Think the World Needs. This is on a global and a national level, but it's equally obvious on the personal level. Now, I am the mother of 15 children, and this gives me a unique position to witness what happens on a personal level. Okay, as I traipse about with my whole bunch of little ducklings in a row, you know, I've always had little kids with me until recently, often while sporting a bun in the oven, you know, I have received a whole bunch of different reactions. One time I was grocery shopping and I had my groceries in one cart and all my little kids in another, and I was pregnant. And I think a couple of them, I may have had like 3 little kids in the cart and 2 kids on the side holding onto the cart, and then I was filling our groceries in another cart and I was pulling everybody. All right, so this lady stands at the aisle and looks at me, and she just kind of gawks, like she's like a look of shock on her face, and then she disappeared. And I thought that was kind of odd. Well, she brings back with her this other woman, and they both stand there and they just laughed and slapped their thighs, and they laughed, and then they disappeared. And that was just really odd, but that was one of the most memorable ones I've ever had to deal with. But I've had lots of stuff. Okay. Now I've heard much worse, grievously the worst in church and among our pastor friends. Okay. And what I found is, while we declare that as believers we're pro-life, we are actually often anti-baby in practice. Okay. It's the older women that really surprised me when I first got into the ministry with my husband. It's understandable that worldly women would sit around and bitterly bemoan motherhood, but when it's a group of pastors' wives, then that's a tragedy. One woman who was well known as one of the 20% that did 80% of the work in a local church. Now, she wasn't a pastor's wife. She was just a worker in a church. You know how that works, right? heard this from her pastor upon announcing her pregnancy. He said to her, "I don't really like it when you get pregnant because your work at the church suffers." Yes, he actually said that to her. What an ugly thing to say. She went on to quit the church and have 6 children. Praise God. Okay. It's one thing to declare God to be our provider, our protector, our healer, and another to show it by the way we actually live. Here's a scripture that should settle the question for believers from the very foundation of our faith. And it's in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. His creation, his intentions, his vision for humanity and the earth. And what are his intentions? Well, let's go to Genesis for that. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." That's Genesis 1:28. Yeah. So, God has never, this is a commandment God gave to them, and it's never been rescinded. Here's another verse. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. That's Psalm 24:1. Okay, if you own something, isn't it up to you to use it as you see fit? Why wouldn't it be logical that God would have intentions for what he owns? Where is there in the Bible a mention of a lack of resources, or of people being a pathogen destroying the earth? Even Revelation talks about the multitudes of people who are going to be in heaven for eternity that started in the earth, okay? And this is Revelation chapter 7, verse 9. After these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude which no one could number, of all nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes, with palm branches in their hands. Okay, a great multitude which no one could number. So God is not worried about too many people. He loves people. The more the merrier, right? He wants the more the merrier in his presence. Okay, now, while I appreciate the perspectives of the writers of superabundance and others like them, they only support the truth that God knows what he's doing and that God loves people. God gave us a planet that would support all the people he wanted to see in that planet. And when we consider babies and children and people to be negative things, that hurts the heart of God, because that's not what he says and that's not what he sees. So in my life, and maybe in your life too, I have decided that I am going to cooperate with him and bless him and be open to the babies that he loves. So I hope that information kind of gives you a different perspective. And it's just a start. And you can do your own research, and you can look into all this stuff, and you can talk to God about your own life, whatever that may be. If you can't have children yourself, maybe you can just be an encouragement and a help to someone else who wants to have a baby. Just saying. Maybe you could be a support to young mommies who are struggling, who have problems with being able to find time to even cook dinner or clean the house, or run errands even. I actually, when I had my little babies, I had 3 under 3, there was a precious lady who helped me. And she would help me. She would take me to appointments, and she would help watch the kids while I was in an appointment. And she just did, and she would bring me over things to eat. She just felt it was her ministry in the Lord to bless me. Isn't that precious? And you know what? We don't realize how many people that we could help in this vein if we would just become a positive voice for them. And if you're open to God, to trust him, and he will bless you. I had to trust God many, many times. And even currently, just because my youngest is 15 doesn't mean I have struggles as a mom. But as I trust him, I find my relationship with him only deepens, and my trust in him only deepens, and I only see him as more and more precious in my life. So I hope that blesses you, and I hope you have a wonderful day. I'm still working on the Commonplace book number 3. I've kind of not had as much time because I've been doing all this research, but now that I've done this next couple of weeks, I can just focus on that. Maybe I'll get it done. Praise God. And we'll have another book to announce soon. And I know Christmas is coming up, and I know it'll be fun, maybe to have something fun for your kids. Who knows? Okay. Well, you have a wonderful day. Please like and subscribe and click the bells. And I love you. Bye-bye.